And thank you for joining us for this Financial Poise webinar. I am Candace Klein, a bankruptcy and commercial law professor at the University of Toledo College of Law and an attorney with Saul Ewing in Chicago. I look forward to being your moderator today. This episode is the fourth and last installment of a four-part webinar series called MBA Bootcamp. We have covered EBITDA and valuation, financial statements, KPIs, cash management, and budgeting. Today's episode is about profits and mastering the concept of working capital. Speaking of the PowerPoint deck, we do not go through it in order. This webinar, like all Financial Poise webinars, is a conversation. When I ask a panelist a question that relates to a slide, I will call that slide out to your attention. Slide 6 discusses and introduces this particular episode. Slide 7 summarizes the MBA Bootcamp series. And if you look at slide 8, you will see 4 episodes in the series listed there. Our panelists are listed on slide 4, and they are Ken Yeager of New Point Advisors, Terry Orr of HKA, John Levitsky, also of HKA, and Natasha Persico Escobedo of Epstein Knock Escobedo. Like I said, I am your moderator. I am Candace Klein with Toledo Law and Saul Ewing. We appreciate that you are not spending your time and money to hear infomercials. If you want to get to know us better, you may read more about us on slides 34 through 38. Financial Poise webinars are supported in part by sponsors. The sponsor for this webinar is the National Law Review. The National Law Review is a premier legal news website with comprehensive coverage, expert analysis, and daily updates. Information about the National Law Review and how to sign up is highlighted on slide 3. Then we have on slide 39 at the end of the deck, we have a special offer provided by Financial Poise speaker and author Steve Strasser, who is the author of this book, MBA in a Day 2.0. He has graciously provided an exclusive benefit to Financial Poise users, which is a discount on his book. The information is available here on slide 39. About Financial Poise, you can read more about Financial Poise on slides 2 and 41. And before you do anything else, go to financialpoise.com now and subscribe to the free weekly newsletter. If you are attending the live premiere of this webinar, you can submit questions using your web portal. We may have an opportunity to address questions. If you are watching this on demand or have any questions after the webinar, then see slide 32 for instructions on how to get an answer. Slide 5 is a disclaimer. You should not go out and act based on what you learn in this webinar. You are not our clients. We are not your lawyers or advisors. What we are doing here is providing you general education, not for you to act without appropriate advice, but rather to help you coordinate and communicate with your trusted professional advisors. This is not advice that is personal to you. Okay, thanks for your patience. Now, without further ado, let's begin our conversation about profit and working capital. And we're going to begin with slides 11 and 12. So let's get into it. I'm going to turn to Natasha first. Natasha, could you introduce for us the definition of working capital as succinctly as possible?
Sure, Candace. So working capital is basically the difference between a company's current assets and a company's current liabilities. And it represents the liquidity available to a business after the satisfaction of its short-term obligations. The basic formula for working capital is just current assets less current liabilities. However, it should be noted, and I think we'll talk about this a little bit more later, that there are different ways that companies and business owners can think about working capital and the quality of working capital. Some people will use a net working capital formula in order to compute what they might believe is a better idea of the real liquidity in the business. So that can look like current assets accepting cash, less current liabilities accepting the current portion of long-term debt.
Thank you very much. Terry, how does one calculate working capital?
Well, I think we've covered it, that it is current assets minus current liabilities.
And what is a current asset?
Current assets are items such as things that assets that could be converted to cash within 1 year.
Okay, great. So let's go to Ken. And why don't you take us a little deeper on this idea of current assets? And I'm going to direct the audience to slide 13. So
Yeah.
what are the main components of current assets?
Okay, so we have great examples here. Cash is that one fun thing that everybody gets to wrap their heads around. But accounts receivable, so when I sell stuff on credit and I haven't been paid yet, you actually get credit on your income statement, your balance sheet for that asset. Somebody owes you something. And general business terms are that you're going to get paid in less than a year, to Terry's point, so it counts as one of our current assets. Then there's inventory. If you're a good steward of your assets and you are moving your inventory in a timely fashion, your inventory usually sits less than a year, and you can count that as a current asset. Then we get into marketable securities, a bit like cash, kind of a lesser, I would say in the entrepreneurial world where I spend a lot of my time, not a lot of marketable securities laying around, but in your bigger companies where you have more treasury management and more security, more sensitivity about interest rates and what you're getting in your yield of your cash. Marketable securities are something that can be held on to and tend to be chopped up into blocks that it can be in the 30, they can be instant, but at 30 and 60 and 90-day blocks. One of the things I'll add, since it was on this page, is that there's, this is all about within a year. There are certain industries that have working capital cycles that are longer than a year. You can think about this in the exploration world, where CapEx starts to look like working capital, and it takes so long to pull something out that what you consider to be inventory or receivable or could take longer, but also contracts could take longer than 1 year. And there's lots of different ways that accountants have come up with ways to follow the lawyers through the various machinations of things that are make an acceptable contract. And that becomes, something of a working capital item as well, but it can be longer.
That's great. Okay, so there's some analytical flexibility here on current assets. Well, let's go to the second part of that equation, current assets minus current liabilities. That leads us to John. So John, slide 14, could you talk to us about the main components of current liabilities?
Yes, thank you. The current liabilities are essentially what a company owes in the near term, what it needs to pay within the next 12 months. The classic items in current liabilities are really mirror images of the current assets that Ken just mentioned, plus a few additional things. So on this slide 14, we see accounts payable. So from the asset side, current assets, these accounts payable may be for same items that Ken's client may be reflecting accounts receivable for. It might be purchases of inventory. It might be purchases of services. Accrued expenses are expenses that are accrued. It's an estimate that's made periodically based upon usually a contract or a relationship. So we have listed here salaries and wages and taxes such as income taxes. Today's world, that may include tariffs, and it may include some other things like rent expense or subscriptions. These are things that come about in the course of operating a business, like utilities, electric, gas, and the like. Interest and debt due within 1 year. I mentioned that to some extent, these are mirror images of the current assets. So Ken mentioned cash. It's possible that the cash in part is a result of borrowings. Perhaps this company undertakes some working capital loans during the near term to generate some cash. And so interest and debt for whatever purposes that they are due. That would be the principal, and the interest that's coming due within 1 year would be booked. Warranty liability. Some companies have an obligation to repair or have some other exposure on their products or services if there is a claim. So companies quite often are booking an accrued amount, in part based upon actual experience, and then also, in addition, an estimate based upon what claims they don't know about yet, but they do expect, based upon some experience, maybe actually have incurred, but no one's filed a claim before so far. And unearned revenues. Many companies take in cash before they actually earn the revenue. They might be prepaid. Uh, it might be just ordinarily the way a company does business. Think about an airline. When you buy airline tickets, you're usually not buying an airline ticket in midair during a flight. You're usually buying an airline ticket a few weeks, sometimes a few months in advance. So if you were to look at the financial statements of an airline, you may see some unearned revenue type accounts, or sometimes called deferred revenue, to recognize the fact that they got paid up front, but they earn the revenue a few weeks or a few months later. And some companies have a multi-year relationship. Perhaps you buy a subscription and they give you a special rate if you prepay up front, and it's a multi-year arrangement, so they would recognize the earning of those revenues over a period of time. And from a current liability perspective, the amount that's unearned would be reduced as time progresses.
Okay, so we're really getting into it and we have categories and some complexity. So Terry, could you give us your view as to how much liberty does a company have in classifying an asset or a liability as current? And what is at stake in such a classification?
Thanks, Candace. On the surface, it may appear that there isn't much flexibility in classifying an asset or a liability as current. However, as this discussion has progressed, Ken brought up examples, Natasha brought up different examples, and John brought up examples of some of the nuances that exist in the classification of current assets and current liabilities. The first is timing. Current means that it will be collected or paid within a year or a reporting cycle. However, within a year, current assets and current liabilities may turn over multiple times. So if you look at current assets and current liabilities in smaller time periods, such as 13-month cash flow analysis, which are used in bankruptcy reporting, then what is included in current assets and current liabilities will be different than what they are reporting on an annual basis. So the reason they take in these different types of classifications and what's at stake is the potential of running out of cash if you in the reporting period that you're looking at. So that's what's at risk.
Oh, that's very helpful. Natasha, could you talk about, given that there might be concerns about running out of cash during a particular reporting period, what's an advantage to a company that has a conservative approach to measuring working capital, and maybe provide some further illustrations about managing and monitoring quality for each of these categories?
Yeah, so a conservative working capital approach simply means, just maintaining higher levels of current assets relative to current liabilities. And doing that increases the company's liquidity and hopefully would, serve to reduce the risk of cash shortfalls. But like you mentioned, there's this other component of it, which is, well, what is the actual quality of the current assets? One thing that companies will sometimes do is say, well, in computing my working capital, I'm going to take into account potential inventory obsolescence, and I'm going to only count 80% of my inventory as part of that working capital computation. Or, receivables are collection of receivables are lagging, or some of these receivables there's doubt as to their collectability, and so I'm only going to count 75%. So now that working capital computation becomes more conservative in that you're not counting that you're not banking on being able to collect 100% of your receivables, and you're not banking on being able to convert 100% of your inventory into cash received through the sales process. And I think that a company could have multiple scenarios, best case, most likely, or worst case in computing their working capital needs. And that conservative approach would, serve to build some credibility with lenders if the company has any borrowings, and investors if they have any equity investors, and can help during times of economic uncertainty or when there are revenue fluctuations and receivables fluctuations.
Thank you very much. So John, we've been talking a lot about cash. It seems important. So with what you have just heard, could you defend the statement, cash is king?
That statement it can be looked at in multiple contexts. From a practical perspective, cash is king reflects that when we talk about current assets and current liabilities and calculating working capital, cash is at the top of the list. Why? Because it's the most liquid. How's liquidity measured in every one of these situations? The time that current assets take to be able to be converted to cash. And also sometimes there's a fee or a cost to converting to cash, but cash is always cash. It's the most liquid there is. The other aspect of this is what can you do with the cash? You have a lot of flexibility if you have a good working capital and cash management standpoint. Number one, it's very important to have the liquidity, as we're talking about, to be able to sustain the operations of your business and to facilitate growth. That's obviously what could be done with cash to augment liquidity. Second, what else can you do with cash? You can show it to somebody. Who can you show it to? Some very important stakeholders like the investing potential market or the actual investors, the actual lenders. Cash on a balance sheet can be a positive. It can reflect creditworthiness. It can reflect lower risk perceptions on the part of investors or lenders. And sometimes cash is part of a compensating balance. So not all cash is necessarily completely liquid. If some of it is dedicated as a potential compensating balance to facilitate getting a larger loan. But those are some of the things that can be done with cash. And then from a risk perspective, so far we've been focusing mostly on return on investment. That's mostly what investors are interested in. But what are equity investors also interested in? Avoiding risk and finding additional upside opportunities that come along sort of once in a blue moon. So what are the risks? Just right now, we are at the end of April of 2025. This is a time when we all know that there are some market variations that might not have been anticipated a few months ago. We all know that 5 years ago, we were going through COVID. Late 2000s, we're going through the Great Recession. And then depending what industry you're in, these are all examples of surprises and turns in the marketplace for which having additional cash on hand could help avoid some risk. And how could it set the stage for some opportunity? Sometimes when there are these downturns, whether they're seasonal or major market swings, some of your competitors who you think have a very good business model, maybe they're short on cash. Maybe they're short on working capital. Maybe this is an opportunity, if you hypothetically have an abundance of cash, to go and finance an acquisition and take over one of your peers. So facilitate operations and growth to help manage risk and also to help position yourselves for opportunities. And this isn't just me talking. You could go look at the balance sheet of Berkshire Hathaway, managed by Warren Buffett. You could go look at the balance sheet of Apple, many years ago called Apple Computer. Now it's evolved far beyond that. You will see on their balance sheet billions and billions of dollars of cash. To some extent, that is dry powder to facilitate positioning them for potential opportunities acquisitions to some extent is they find it's helpful to have a very strong balance sheet. As we're going to talk though, you really want to optimize. If you have a lot of cash, you want to invest it to get interest. For example, if you have inventory, a lot of inventory usually has a cost, possibly even an obsolescence or an expiration risk. But cash you can actually generate interest on. But your business, most businesses, you want to generate a lot more than the return you could get on cash. So you want to balance this out to try to optimize the overall expected return of your business.
Yeah, that's great, John. And it brings to mind another phrase of volatility is your friend. So if you're positioned with a healthy amount of cash on the balance sheet and you can be opportunistic or at least weather the storm and your competitors can't, I mean, that all sounds like a great business strategy. All right, so Ken, we are going to turn to you, and we just heard John talk about liquidity when talking about cash. So liquidity and working capital, they're not identical, though they are related concepts. Could you talk us through the difference and how working capital is used in assessing the business? And I will navigate us to slide 15. All right, Ken.
Sure. So I'm going to play a little play on words with what John just said when cash is king in the in keeping with liquidity and timing and liquidity and working capital. There's another smaller, lesser known phrase among some of us in the restructuring world called cash is queen, time is king. And it goes right to what John was saying is, can I get the money? When can I get my hands on it? And this goes very much to our conversation about, okay, I've got my liquidity, I've got my cash, which would be measured just like Natasha was telling us. We've got these current, current assets minus current liabilities. And here's my working capital. I can get into all kinds of formulas of net and gross of those components of cash and receivables and inventory. And let's just say my receivables are, and in a good world, liquidity is what all those things are doing for me, kind of the net result, right? So I've got my working capital, which is this equation, and liquidity is this net result, and it changes based on what happens to those working capital components. For example, not to get long-winded because Terry and John have gone through a lot of this already, but if my receivables go from 30 days to 60 days, they get long dated, they don't convert to cash as quickly, and so liquidity dries up. So I have a little less liquidity. I have inventory that takes longer to convert certain times of the year, maybe seasonality or some other structural issue. And now my liquidity dries up at certain times of the year versus, say, the holidays where my inventory is just burning off the shelves. But I get to January and February and February, and it's a little harder to convince people to buy my stuff. So that liquidity is that net result of that working capital in motion. I think we'll leave it there for a moment.
So this is very helpful, and we're talking about a cycle, a cash conversion cycle concept here as well. So why don't we pivot here to Natasha, who can talk about this operating cycle. What is the cash conversion cycle, and how do those concepts relate to each other? Natasha.
Yeah, so I think that this question is right on time, considering we're talking about time being king, and the operating cycle is basically the time it takes for a business to convert raw materials or inventory into cash liquidity from sales. And the relationship between the operating cycle and the cash conversion cycle is that in the cash conversion cycle, we just consider the additional element of, well, how much time does it take us to pay our accounts payable? So it's the days inventory outstanding plus days sales outstanding less days payable outstanding. So, these metrics help a company assess how efficiently a business is managing its working capital and how quickly it's recovering cash from operations in terms of days.
Oh, so another very helpful management concept. And so let's go to Terry, and we're going to now go back through the different types of working capital that we have, and I'm going to note slides 17 through 23. So Terry, talk to us about the different types of working capital that a company may use.
Sure. Thanks, Candace. Working capital, gross working capital, excuse me, only considers current assets. And I think John spent some time addressing how you maximize the return on your current assets. So that's how come you have gross working capital. The sum of all current assets are convertible to cash within a year or less. That's what would be your gross working capital. So net working capital is the sum of all current assets minus the sum of all current liabilities. These can be put in a timeline to show improvements or decline in working capital. So as you have ebbs and flows in your working capital, you can see those coming before you're hit with those. So those are kind of the basic concepts. And then you have this concept of time that I think Natasha addressed. So breaking that down, you have regular working capital, which is permanent working capital that is required for the company's ordinary operations for working capital to cycle to flow smoothly. So this is kind of your baseline. This is the amount of working capital you need for things to operate smoothly. And then you have reserve working capital, and this kind of in that line of permanent working capital. That reserve working capital takes into consideration a cushion the company must maintain above a regular working capital for contingencies that may arise unexpectedly. And I think we've addressed some of that as well. And then you have this concept of temporary working capital, which involves seasonal working capital and special working capital. Seasonal working capital is the fluctuation of working capital caused by effects of seasons such as agricultural projects, schools, festivals, seasonality, businesses with seasonality. And then special working capital addresses the fluctuations in working capital caused by unforeseen events such as weather conditions, and those could be extreme heat or cold, floods, sudden changes in government policies such as tariffs, pandemics, things of that nature. So that kind of works through that chart that we have. I believe it's on page 17.
Yeah, that's great. So we have time, we have various buckets that I think assist us with planning. So let's take another slice at this permanent versus fixed working capital concept, and I'll turn to John. And this issue is covered on slides 24 and 25.
Well, thank you. The regular working capital, there's no such thing as one fixed amount of permanent working capital. There are variations. Ken and Tasha and Terry touched on some of those components for seasonality or other types of major risk fluctuations, potential growth and the like. But thinking from a practical perspective, if we were to compare two companies, like I mentioned, Southwest Airlines, one of the largest airline companies headquartered here in the US, and there's also another example, Kroger, the largest standalone grocery chain in the United States. And if you were to compare those two companies and look at their balance sheets, you'd find on Kroger's balance sheet, they're both publicly traded companies, you can look this up for yourselves, they have a much higher percentage of their assets in working capital than Southwest. And if you're wondering why, it's because one is a major retailer. They have large amounts of inventory to hold, make available, purchase, fund those purchases, and also fund to the extent there is some carrying time required before the inventory is turned over. In contrast, Southwest, what inventory do they have? They have a very minor amount of inventory. They are really driven by their investment in their fixed assets, their planes and related transportation equipment. Southwest would have a relatively small percentage of its assets in working capital, perhaps just a few percent, and Kroger may have 15 or 20% of its assets, a percentage of that in working capital. So what is that reflecting? That to drive the success of the operations month to month, a long time, there's really an amount of working capital that needs to be staying with the business. How does that become really important? If you're doing a valuation or you're planning for the cash flow of the company over the next few periods or few years, what you have to realize is there will be future cash flows that come into the business. That's what's planned for, that's what's expected. But not all those amounts that come in can be distributed or reinvested in other activities, because there's this amount that needs to be maintained, at least on a relative basis, to keep the company's operations sustained. And so that's what we're referring to as the permanent fixed working capital, but it does fluctuate, and it is driven by some other metrics, such as the level of activity based upon revenues, and also their cash operating cycle, which we talked about earlier.
That's very helpful. So let's do a hypo. Now that we have all these foundational points covered, let's do a hypo and we'll turn to Ken. All right, so let's pretend that I didn't listen to a word of this webinar and I go out and buy a business that has millions of dollars on its balance sheet. And let's also assume that its EBITDA is strong and is supposed to be $12 million this year. Expenses are less than $800,000 a month. I'm good, right? I have no cash flow issues, right? And this looks like a great investment. What do you think, Ken?
I'm shaking in my boots, Candace, as you speak. So there are a number of ways this could go wrong. But first, let's also make sure, without getting too long-winded, that for our audience that may not be watching some of the other webinars, what EBITDA is. So this is a bottom line perspective, like a net income, that my income statement is, in fact, producing profits of some sort, right? And now everyone gets a little bit confused and then says, so I've got this proxy for profit. And if we get really close to it, we'd say it's almost like net income, but there are some adjustments, right? However, what it doesn't do is pay any attention to my balance sheet, this thing where working capital hides, right? So there's a little working capital passes through the income statement in a way, but really it hides over in the balance sheet. So, well, the income statement has got a green light flashing. Hey, Candace had $12 million in EBITDA, fantastic, very little expenses. I have this other problem over on the balance sheet, or could have a problem, which is where are the assets and where are they tied up in my liabilities? In order to bring $12 million, I'm going to start down this path. In order to bring that $12 million to pass, I might have to throw all the cash I had in the business out to a contractor to go do work. Or I might set up contracts with my customers where they don't need to pay me this year for the services that I render. So my $12 million in EBITDA doesn't bring any cash. I don't get any all my receivables or stay receivables. They never convert to cash in this period of time. Maybe it's some 5-year contract to do some sort of crazy piece of business, and everything comes at the end. Think the oil industry or some exploration sort of exercise, or I go build you a ship and I don't get progress paying. It takes me maybe a year or two to build that ship for you. So things can get a little wonky on that side. And then there's inventory. So I mentioned cash leaving the door. One of the reasons cash might leave the door is to go purchase the inventory to explore, make, create something that is going to be that has this incredible economic value that says $12 million of EBITDA, still not an ounce of cash in my hand. And then I have, says that on that cash side, the other thing that after I bought the inventory, I might be paying for people to make things. So I've got a lot of working capital going on. I got overhead pushed out the door, might have paid a sales team to go do stuff. They want their commissions, and all that cash is churning out the door without any cash churning in the door. So Candace, on the surface of it, it's not quite as warm and fuzzy as it seems.
Oh, darn. All right. So I guess we do actually need to know something about this working capital concept.
Yep.
All right. So Natasha, let's pretend now that I've listened to this webinar, but I'm still a little slow on the uptick. How do I figure out how much working capital my company will need?
Okay, well, I think it's important to go back to something that all of my fellow panelists have mentioned in one way or another, which is this idea of forecasting, and also more broadly that valuation is forward-looking, and uh, really where this budgeting and this working capital analysis becomes quite useful is trying to meet your needs for the future, right? So, the goal is to maintain enough working capital to operate efficiently without tying up so much working capital that it's sitting there unnecessarily and not being utilized for other things. But I think it's important to just start with a historical analysis of what working capital needs have been, but keep in mind that that is really the starting point. And you have one, especially as a business owner, and I'm assuming that we might be talking to a fair amount of smaller business owners, you have to have a forward-looking perspective. So yes, historically my needs have been X, but X, Y, and Z is going to happen. I'm planning an expansion. I have cost increases that I'm expecting to occur for a variety of reasons. Payroll is going to go up. The cost of producing this product is expected to change. My margin on a particular project is expected to change. So it really having a forward-looking and change oriented perspective will help in figuring out a particular company's working capital needs. I think also going back to some things we've already discussed, analyzing the particular operating cycle. How long does it take me to convert my raw materials or my inventory into cash? How quickly am I collecting my receivables? How quickly am I paying my current liabilities that are associated with the sales that I'm generating, and figuring out, how long of a cycle do you really have, and how much liquidity, how much working capital do you need to feel comfortable within the realms of that cycle, considering anything that might change. So it's a lot to explain succinctly in a nutshell, but it's really what has to be done.
Wow. Well, I think I now have a good checklist the next time I'm looking at buying a new business. So I think you've helped me with due diligence. All right, let's move to this definitional exercise here. And we're going to go back to slide 18 and 19 and pivot back to John, because we're going to get really good on this working capital concept. So John, can you talk to us about the difference between gross and net working capital and why someone would want to know what gross working capital is?
Yes, we heard earlier from our other panelists about the difference being primarily the gross working capital is all current assets, and that net working capital is the excess of current assets minus current liabilities. So why do we care? We're looking for quality, and we're looking for what can be done with the working capital. So if you think about the math that we just mentioned about current assets minus current liabilities equals net working capital, a company could have a working capital amount of zero, or a relatively minor amount, but because of the math, A minus B, current assets minus current liabilities, there could be relatively huge amounts in current assets and in current liabilities that net out to be roughly zero. And so you want to take a look at the components of the working capital amounts. From the current asset side, liquidity is very important to know about. And also it's important to put the current assets in context. For example, if you wanted to drive sales, revenue, one way might be to have an additional credit facility. But if a company starts extending credit, on its own to customers to drive sales. If a company's policy perhaps is looking a little too aggressive or a little too generous, receivables might be very large, which would be driving up the current asset side of working capital. It might look like sales revenue is up too, but in the long run, there may be risks that that quality of that receivable is not as high as one would like or expect. There may be risks of bad debt, expense that's unforeseen, needing to be recognized to reduce those amounts later. And it also might suggest that when I said overly aggressive, maybe they're taking on a lot more risk than they ordinarily would by offering more financing. Quite often, this is a very legitimate situation, but you want to take a look at not only receivables and put those in context, you want to take a look at inventory. Are they matching inventory, not just in terms of numbers, but one of the keys to success in a lot of businesses, if you are a business that sells product through inventory, is matching it to your demand. Some of the companies like Macy's and Target over the years, their buyers were well known to be able to adjust to the marketplace. On the other hand, if you see jewelry stores sometimes fail, even though it seems like there's demand for the product in general in a certain industry, quite often it's a situation where the buyers haven't matched the inventory to what the current more fashionable areas are of demand. So it's very important from a qualitative and contextual standpoint to understand what's in current assets.
Wow, so this sounds really challenging. And I would say to a certain extent, although we've been talking about quality, we've had an assumption that this formula for working capital ends up with a positive number. But Terry, could you talk to us about negative working capital, and is negative working capital always a bad thing?
You potentially are going to have negative working capital over a short period of time. It doesn't always mean that it's bad. It could be that you can take advantage of a good situation by temporarily having negative working capital, such as making an early payment to get a good significant discount would be an example. So there are good reasons. There could be good reasons for having negative working capital. It could also be the early signs of erosion of the company. So you have to look at, what's behind the negative working capital and what is causing it. But it doesn't always mean that it's bad.
Okay, so again, we have to get behind the numbers. So let's do a definitional exercise again, and we'll pivot to Ken and slide 26. So Ken, can you talk to us about the difference between permanent or fixed working capital and temporary working capital?
A lot's been said on this topic today, and so I want to try and put a slightly different twist to it to give us a little more rounding, because I think John and Terry have brought this home very, very neatly. When I think about permanent working capital, there's a certain amount of my business model that is set in a pattern where I have extended terms, maybe because of what I want to do as a business to grow it, or maybe what I'm forced to do because of competition in a significant industry, which is to say, for example, I've had to make my accounts receivable terms net 60 days. So this is the only way I'm going to be able to attract the current customer market in a commercial space. Or maybe I'm giving customers some sort of financing. So I pay as you go, 36 months easy installments, or as we've seen today in the credit card world, the buy here, pay later 3-month installment agreements that have started to come into the world. And so that I've set a model for how I'm getting collected. And I can apply this to my inventory side of the world and say, I've got certain vendors that ship to me on a certain time pattern. It takes weeks for it to get here. It takes me, but they require a certain amount of payments in order for me to get the inventory started on their books, and a certain amount to arrive, or maybe I can get to pay them a little bit later. Either way, these things are permanent. They are business model decisions that I've made. that going to exist, and I can't really spend a lot. I generally speaking don't get a whole lot of flexibility around trying to move those around. However, I might reach an inflection point where I need to make something change that Terry was talking about. I want to see the business grow. Don't want something to happen, and I might change my terms, make it harder for customers to get their receipt to get my materials, and so I might make it so that only my best customers can pay me, or the only people I will send stuff to are my best customers who pay me on time or early. And I might have a situation where I need to move inventory for a season up. So I was hoping to get something to show up in a certain amount of time with normal planning, but now I've got to boost that. A customer's come to me and said, I have a great opportunity to sell through a lot of your stuff, but you need to get it to me in time. So I'm going to incentivize my supply chain and maybe pay a little cash to have them jump their orders to get the stuff to me. I'm now making a business model decision in the temporary state of things, and creating these temporary working capital conditions where I'm going to need more money to go out to the market. So that's I think a better way to think about how temporary and permanent fit against one another. I will lead into with this too. There's a lot of people who use the ratios that are also turned to what we call days capital outstanding, which is what Natasha was talking about. So my dollars actually convert into days. So instead of I have $1 million of receivables outstanding, I have 60 days of receivables outstanding, and it's making those flexible changes in my model about how fast I want to be paid that affects those ratios about days.
All right, that's very helpful, and thanks for highlighting the ratio concept. So Natasha, could you describe what is a working capital adjustment?
Yeah, I think there's a couple ways to think about this. In the context of our discussion today, a working capital adjustment refers to changes a business makes to maintain the appropriate working capital amounts, considering things like a lot of what we've already discussed, uh, changes in the business, special circumstances, or seasonal changes, or changes in the company's operating cycle. But there's another way to think about a working capital adjustment, and it happens in context of a valuation or some sort of pending transaction, where in a valuation, a company's working capital is analyzed, and if there is a deficiency or a surplus in the company's working capital, then a working capital adjustment is made in order to adjust for that surplus or deficiency as part of the valuation of the entity itself. And when we're talking about this concept of a surplus or deficiency, well, a surplus or deficiency as compared to what? And it could be a surplus or deficiency compared to peers in the industry, which is sometimes useful, or it could be a surplus or deficiency compared to expected working capital needs on a forward-looking basis from the perspective of the buyer, right? So I think that, so much has already been said about, monitoring for, changes in seasonal patterns and those working capital needs, and monitoring for special events like, extreme weather or regulatory changes and the tariffs and everything else. But there's this whole other way of thinking about a working capital adjustment that happens in a transaction that I thought would, just also be something important to mention.
Okay, thank you. Terry, we're going to pivot to you and give us an understanding as to how a company may strike a balance between the objectives of profitability and liquidity, and we'll navigate to slide 30. Terry.
Okay, well, companies may employ specific policies governing working capital to maintain satisfactory levels of capital and profitability. So that's one way that they strike this balance. And this balance can be struck based on industry. So you have an industry, I think we've covered a lot of different examples today where the inventory might turn over very quickly, and so you need less, you have more in working capital, or it might turn over very slowly and you have less in working capital and more in capital asset expenditures. You also have sales cycles and seasonality and all those types of things where you try to strike a balance between liquidity and profitability. And that fits into this, I think we've talked around this quite a bit today, and that is this composition or looking at profitability, risk, and liquidity kind of analysis. So example of that might be if I'm doing well profitably and I have good liquidity, I might want to expand my credit on my sales and issue more credit, which is taking on additional risk. But because I have the flexibility to do that, it might be allow me to have that option, take on the additional risk, and increase sales and increase my profitability by so doing. So there's a lot of things that go into this striking a balance between profitability and liquidity, and it's very industry specific and company specific, and there's a lot of art in doing this.
Yeah, so we have a lot of art, and we've talked about the future and planning and also some ratios. This is in the bucket called forecasting. So let's pivot to John, and I'll direct us to slide 29. So John, could you talk to us about some forecasting concepts that are relevant to working capital projections?
Yes, and the forecasting ability is going to depend in large part on what type of information is available, both historic and prospective, also regarding peers in the industry. And it's going to turn in part, in a lot of cases, on the business plan. So yes, the company that's already established, we can look at the history and we can develop some metrics. We can look at trends. We can look at relative measures like you have listed on the slide. Days sales outstanding, inventory, days payables outstanding. We can calculate the working capital and cash cycles. We can also measure these relative to items that reflect activity of the business, such as revenues or number of customers, number of transactions, and the like. And we can develop some models and we can apply those going forward. So if we have an idea as to where the company is currently and where management expects it to go and how management wants to get there, we can use these metrics to model out based upon the overall forecasts and business plan for the business on how the needs and amounts of working capital retention evolve over a period of time. The business plan is usually important too because companies don't necessarily run in straight lines or in a flat situation. Companies are quite often trying to grow, and effective working capital management can facilitate the growth. How can you thwart growth? Well, we have Ken here who will tell you from a turnaround perspective that when a company cannot pay its bills as they come due, that's a big problem. It may lead to either need to restructure or may even lead to bankruptcy. On the other hand, if you have the current assets, you have the net working capital, you have the cash to pay your bills as they come due. And if a company is growing and maintaining a relatively reasonable risk management approach, the working capital position can really facilitate that. So it's using the metrics, it's putting it in context, but ideally you have an ability to also align it with a business plan and cash flow forecast for the overall business.
Yeah, that sounds great. So there's a lot of work here, and a lot of numbers, and there's some management, right? We have to make some judgment calls, and one of those might have to do with payment terms. So, Ken, that might be voluntary or involuntary, but I will pivot to you in slide 31 and talk to us about how payment terms can affect working capital.
Absolutely. These are they're two sides of the same coin. You push on a policy, you will be changing the way your working capital impacts your business. And it may also be that you aren't pushing on a policy, but you're not enforcing a policy. So compliance, as much as terms, create these issues. We have plenty of situations where, let's say, a weak financial position, a market inflection point, or a competitive situation will cause someone to slip and slide versus their what they consider to be a good norm for their business into a situation where their terms or policies aren't enforced, and therefore customers are taking advantage of them to a degree, or they don't feel that they have the leverage to stop it from happening. You get situations that people will warn you against all the time, like customer concentrations, where our customer is so big that they sort of the tail wags the dog. They'll tell you when they're going to pay you, and you get sort of comfortable with the idea that that's just the way it's going to be. So those terms end up being just about everything in terms of how your liquidity is going to work in your business, and that can ultimately then start to have a secondary effect on profitability. So short-term customer payments, longer vendor payments. Um, I can look at the customer who's decided they're going to make your receivables long-term. There are plenty of stories out there in the private equity world where terms are set by fiat, not necessarily by policy, at 87 to 89 days, which is a cutoff day that sort of fits inside of what a bank would consider reasonable. I consider it sometimes a form of abuse, but it's also very aggressive behavior that you have to be mindful of in this policy world that you're living in. Um, Just-in-time deliveries. When am I going to get this stuff? When am I going to pay for it? You can certainly just-in-time says I'm going to get my stuff very quickly, but then you've got to turn it over with that policy of doing just-in-time versus another policy, the other version of that policy, which is what we call just in case, where you're buying and stockpiling inventory, which is what's been going on for the last 6 months, where people have been worried about tariffs and they've been loading up on inventory, even though they're not sure if and when they're going to need it. They're going to pile up. That policy of buying things early, getting your purchasing people loosened up, and blowing out their ratios around inventory management and cost, start to have an effect on your working capital. Um, Lower minimum vendor order quantities. Here's an area where we've got this, otherwise the term that's called EOQ, or economic order quantity, which is when we buy 1,000 of these, this has been considered the optimum way for our vendor to get us at the lowest cost at the right time what we need. You start getting into a working capital situation and you can't buy 1,000 at a time. You start buying 100 at a time or 10 at a time. Well, we have handling charges and freight costs, and we have all kinds of expenses. And while my liquidity might be able to handle it, I'm just taking the money off my balance sheet and sort of making the income statement soak it up, and I start to lose profitability. So again, a policy change that is affecting our working capital.
Yeah, I think that's important. These are all things to have a finger on. And so, Terry, we have just a couple minutes left, but we've talked a lot about use of cash, whether it's investing, whether it's a line of credit. Obviously these payment terms might also implicate the cost of borrowing and interest rate. So Terry, could you talk to us about the relationship between working capital management and interest rate management?
Sure, Candace. So if you wait until you need cash, you will pay the highest interest rates to get it. So short-term borrowings are more expensive than long-term borrowings. Therefore, by managing working capital, you can manage interest rates. So, and that's kind of my short answer. kind of a wrap up on these discussions is I can't tell you how many times I've seen healthy businesses get into trouble because they expand or do something, and as a result, get their working capital out of balance and their borrowing rates out of whack, and as a result, end up seeking someone like Ken on a turnaround situation to sell the business or try to get it turned around, or go, or it's headed into bankruptcy. So.
Oh, you're absolutely right. And I like the warning about short-term borrowing
Yeah.
because that tends to precipitate the death of the enterprise and often comes with personal guarantees. So the entire ship is going down. So let's end it there. And I want to thank our panelists. So Ken, John, Natasha, and Terry, thank you very much for joining us. And thank you, audience, for your time and patience. We hope that you've enjoyed today's webinar, which is episode number 4 in Financial Poise's MBA Bootcamp series. This is the final episode of the series. We thank you for listening and have a great day.
Take care. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everybody.